Hello and welcome back to Jay Coletti's Racket Reviews. My name is Jay Coletti and I will be your hostess. Here on Racket Reviews we're dedicated to learning about all things organized crime, and if this is your first episode of the show, welcome. You're probably wondering why I'm saying welcome back. If you're a seasoned viewer of Racket Reviews, you know that I have taken an extended maternity leave to get used to our first baby, Babyface Coletti. And I appreciate that time that you've granted me to do that, and I'm happy to be back. Today, I do want to talk about another babyface, and that's Babyface Nelson, the notorious bank robber and murderer. If you're enjoying the channel and would like to become a Racket Reviews patron, please head on over to that Patreon account and join the Coletti family. Now, without further ado, we have much to discuss, so let's get right to it. Lester Joseph Gillis was born on December 6, 1908 in Chicago, Illinois. It should be noted on the FBI website that Gillis's middle name is listed as starting with the letter M, but I could not find another source or document that provided proof of a middle name starting with M. Gillis was of Belgian descent. His father, Joseph, was a tanner with a slight drinking problem, and his mother, Mary, was a schoolteacher. I have to note here that Gillis's parents were named Mary and Joseph, although they hardly brought to the world the Redeemer of Earth. In fact, many would say just the opposite. Gillis was the youngest of 7 children, and according to his mother, the most beautiful of her babies. Gillis was quite the animal lover growing up, always playing with the family pets and bringing home strays. In Lafayette Public High School, Gillis was considered a very good child and student. Problems started to arise when the family transferred him to St. Mark's Catholic School at the age of 9 in anticipation of his first communion. The tight structure and additional rules sat poorly with Gillis, who began a pattern of truancy. He was frustrated by the rules and missed his friends from Lafayette. This wouldn't have been so bad except Gillis's elder sister, Jenny Gillis, died from influenza during the pandemic on October 19, 1918. 9 years old and terrified at the prospect of death, the young Gillis was forced to look at the body of his sister during her funeral, and this only made his bad behavior worse. When truancy became such an overwhelming problem for Gillis, his parents transferred him to a different Catholic school in Maumins, Illinois, about 50 miles away, by the name of St. Patrick Boarding School. His parents believed that the distance would make this situation better. The exact opposite was true. After a month, little Lester Gillis showed up at his father's work, 50 miles from where he should have been, holding a cat he found in a cornfield and begging his father not to make him attend school so far away. His father was sympathetic and let him return to St. Mark's, where the truancy issues once more became a tremendous problem. There was simply no punishment sufficient to make Gillis stay in class. His mother had even resorted to walking him to school herself, and by lunchtime she would receive word that he was gone. When Gillis was 11, he was kicked out of St. Mark's for truancy violations, and his parents put him back in Lafayette Public. It was too late at this point, though. Gillis was dedicated to skipping class, and at this age had fallen in with a bad crowd. It has been reported that his very first crime was committed at 7 years old, when he shot his friend in the jaw, perhaps accidentally, perhaps on purpose, with a pistol he found on the 4th of July. The only issue with this story is that the shooting took place in 1921. The correct reporting is that Gillis was 12 years old when this took place, and he would spend a year in a reformatory for the crime. Judging by what happened next, and of course the rest of his life, it would seem that Gillis did not take many lessons from the state reformatory. In 1922, he was convicted of auto theft for the first time and was committed to a boys' home. He would be released on parole after 2 years, and then, within 5 months, he would be back. Almost as soon as he was released at age 13, he was arrested for car theft again and sent back to the penal school for 18 months on April 11, 1924. It was from his work as a car thief that he would earn the nickname of Babyface from the members of the Chicago boys gang with whom he was associated. Due to his boyish face, short, 5'4" stature, and weight of 133 pounds, Gillis earned the name that would be cemented into the American zeitgeist for almost a century. However, despite the fact that most Americans would not recognize the name Lester Gillis, but nearly all of them would recognize the name Babyface Nelson, it's funny that very few people in his lifetime would have had the spine to refer to him by his nickname, Face to Babyface. According to Richard Lindbergh, author of The Return to the Scene of the Crime, standing only 5 feet 4 inches, Gillis compensated for his physical limitations with a murderous temper and a willingness to employ a switchblade or a gun without hesitation or remorse for the intended victim. Only the closest associates would refer to him as Jimmy, the shortening of his middle name. Gillis referred to himself as Big George Nelson. Compensating much, Big George? Anyway, other early crimes included running stills and bootlegging during Prohibition, which began in 1920, and of course, armed robbery. By 1929, Nelson was the head of a street gang and working at a Standard Oil station, which would serve as the headquarters for this gang. This group was colloquially referred to as strippers because they stripped tires from cars. This has nothing to do with the word association that we have for strippers today. It was also in 1928 that Nelson would begin his association with the Tooby Gang as a rum runner. His job was to drive bootlegged booze to various locations in the Chicago suburbs. This bootlegging gang, led by Roger Toohey, rivaled Capone's in Chicago. There is far too much to discuss about Roger Toohey in this episode, and he will be getting his own episode in a few months. So for the time being, just know that the Toohey gang was very, very powerful. 1928 was a busy year for Nelson, as he would also meet a salesgirl by the name of Helen Wozniak. Soon after, the two would be married despite family objections, and go on to have 2 children together, a boy and a girl. Ronald, born 6 months after their marriage on April 4th, 1930, and Darlene Helen Gillis, born in 1932. The couple would remain loyal to one another, and Helen, very much aware of what her husband did for money, would travel with him, cover for him, and sometimes even participate in the crime events themselves. Prior to 1933, when it is believed that Nelson began his affiliation with John Dillinger, more on that in a moment, it is widely reported that Nelson was associated with Chicago underworld kingpin Al Capone. Reports claim that Capone had to let Nelson go for being too violent, which is pretty rich coming from the man who was allegedly responsible for, either directly or indirectly, the deaths of over 200 people. Apparently, this time with Capone was short-lived, as by January of 1931, Nelson was sentenced to 1 year to life in prison for bank robbery. We'll get back to the bank robbery arrest in just a moment, but 1930 is the year that Nelson's criminal star began to rise. At 7 p.m. on January 6, 1930, Nelson led a group of hoods in the robbery of Charles M. Richter. Richter was the vice president of Consolidation Magazine Corporation and a millionaire. The robbery itself was quite bold. Nelson and his crew walked right up to the door of the 20-room mansion and asked the maid who answered the door for Richter by name, using an alias himself, of course. When Richter came down to meet his surprise guest, he was met with a pistol pressed to his stomach. Soon, Nelson and his men had Richter and the maid face down on the floor, wrapped in adhesive tape, and they cut the phone lines. The crew was just about to spread out and take what they could when Richter's wife Jean came down the stairs. Richter told his wife to do as the men said, and they had soon forced her to lead them to her valuable jewelry, which totaled $205,000. Although Richter and his wife worked closely with the police to try to find the culprits, neither one of them was able to remember what Nelson or his men looked like, and failed to identify any of them in various mugshots shown to them by law enforcement. Nelson and his crew should have stopped while they were ahead, but they never did. Guys like this never do. Although I will say, in Nelson's case, it paid off several times in a row for him to be risky. I guess they figured that robbing Richter went over so well that 2 weeks later, they repeated a similar crime. On January 22nd, Nelson and his gang struck the home of attorney Stewart J. Templeton. Templeton was not home, and his wife had just put their daughter down for a nap and left the house. The girl was in the care of the Templetons' 2 maids. This time, Nelson and his crew explained at the door that they were interior decorators, and the maid who answered let them in. The first maid was promptly tied up in the kitchen with tape placed over her mouth. The second maid was made to lead the robbers to the Templetons' jewelry, a haul of $5,000, before being tied up with her co-worker with the tape also placed over her mouth. One of Nelson's men apologized for leaving them that way before running off. When Mrs. Templeton returned home, she untied and untaped her maids before running upstairs to check on her daughter. The little girl was unharmed and had slept through the entire robbery. Once again, the Templeton maids were unable to provide law enforcement with a detailed description of the robbers, and Nelson's gang was free to repeat this pattern for a 3rd time. In my opinion, a 3rd robbery would have been pushing it, but then again, I'm not a gambler. They waited 2 months before attempting a 3rd robbery. The pressure was on the police to capture these tape bandits as they became known by the press. Sensing that it was too hot for them to go in with another quick turnaround, it was smart for them to wait. On March 31st, 1930, Nelson did this again to the wealthy widow and her new husband, Count and Mrs. von Bülow. Count Enrique von Bülow also claimed to be a pilot. It turns out that he was neither a count nor a pilot, but a German swindler, 20 years Lottie von Bülow's junior, named Henry Dachau. The couple had met in Central America, and a whirlwind relationship had resulted in a marriage and a honeymoon where the couple traveled around the world. When it came out in the wash that Dachau was not who he claimed he was, Lottie filed for divorce, and it's in the process of these divorce proceedings that our tape bandits entered the picture. Does this have anything to do with the robbery? No, not really, but since Nelson and his crew decided to pretend to be census workers, they got an earful. Lottie's brother-in-law had been the one to answer the door and explained to the alleged census workers that his sister's situation was complicated and that she would be back later. The bandits left and came back when Lottie was home. The tape bandits did their regular routine. They forced Lottie at gunpoint to her jewelry and took it all. During the robbery, however, Lottie's ex-husband came home unaware of the robbery and preparing to collect his things. He too wound up at gunpoint and was robbed of his wrist and pocket watches. According to the report filed by Lottie, the bandits made off with a $40,000 pearl necklace, a $3,500 diamond ring, a $5,000 diamond bracelet, 4 pairs of diamond earrings between the prices of $800 to $5,000, a $3,000 as well as $1,200 pendant, and 3 $300 chains. In total, that's about $65,000 give or take based on some of the values of the diamond earrings. In today's money, that's over $1,150,000 that they got away with for a third time. It would seem that armed robbery must have just been too easy for Nelson, or he wasn't getting a thrill from it, as he began supplementing this income with bank robbery. His first bank robbery was a successful one that took place on April 21st, 1930. He robbed a bank and walked away with about $4,000. He and his gang were still making money off of armed robbery as well, bringing in about $25,000 a month. On October 3rd, 1930, Nelson would take part in another bank robbery, Itasca State Bank. This time, his appearance would be remembered by one of the tellers who told the police. He would walk away with $4,600 from that one. 3 days later, on October 6th, Nelson would rob Chicago Mayor Big Bill Thompson's wife of $18,000 worth of jewelry. And yes, for the more astute viewers of Racket Reviews, that is the same Big Bill Thompson, mayor of Chicago, that was in Capone's pocket. It's from her that we get the famous description of Babyface Nelson. He had a baby face. He was good-looking, hardly more than a boy, had dark hair and was wearing a gray topcoat and a brown felt hat, turned down brim. On November 23, 1930, Nelson and his crew were involved in an attempted robbery of a roadhouse in Summit, Illinois. This robbery attempt failed and spiraled out of control into a gunfight that wounded 3 and killed 3 others. Just 3 days later, on November 26th, Nelson would commit his first murder when robbing a tavern that resulted in the shooting of stockbroker Edwin R. Thompson. After Nelson and his crewmen were identified, and leaving behind a string of dead bodies in their path, law enforcement began zeroing in on the tape bandits. They didn't stop their crime spree, and Nelson would take part in another bank robbery in January of 1931. By the winter of 1931, the tape bandits, Nelson included, were being rounded up. Nelson was convicted of the January robbery charge and sentenced to 1 year to life behind bars in the Illinois State Penitentiary in Joliet, Illinois. After a year, Nelson was to stand trial on another robbery charge in Wheaton, Illinois. On his train ride back to Joliet following the trial, Nelson made a daring escape from the prison guards and, relying on his connections in the Toohey Gang, fled just west of Reno, Nevada, where he hunkered down for a little while as things cooled off. After that, he moved to Sausalito, California, where he would meet and partner with the fellow bootlegger Joe Parenti. While working with Parenti in the San Francisco Bay Area, Nelson got connected with John Paul Chase. Nelson worked as an armed guard for Chase's liquor trucks, and the two men became fast friends. Once established in California, Nelson sent for his wife Helen, who would join them shortly after, with their son. He would return to Reno on business in the winter of 1932, and it was here that he became connected with the bank robber Alden Karpus, of the infamous Barker Karpus gang, who was on vacation. On vacation from bank robbing? I wonder what other benefits that type of career offers, maybe vision and dental? Anyway, it was Karpus who connected Nelson to fellow Midwestern bank robber Eddie Bentz. Nelson would officially team up with Bentz and head back east. He would commit his first bank robbery after returning to the Midwest in Grand Haven, Michigan on August 18, 1933. It didn't turn much of a profit, but he and most of his crewmen were able to escape. After that robbery, Nelson decided to get back into a leadership role with his next robbery, using men he recruited from St. Paul, Missouri at the Green Lantern Tavern. A very cool name for a tavern for any of those DC Comics fans out there, myself included. Nelson traveled all over the Midwest as well as San Antonio, Texas with his new cohorts. During this time, it is believed that he began working with the Dillinger Gang, which we will discuss in a moment. With his crew, Nelson robbed the First National Bank of Brainerd, Michigan on October 23, 1933. They escaped with $32,000. After this, Nelson, his gang, his wife, and his son fled to San Antonio, Texas, where they would purchase modified weapons from the black market to make their future misadventures even more successful. By December of that year, Nelson and his gang were recognized, and the police were made aware. One of Nelson's associates, Tommy Carroll, got into a shootout with police, killing one officer and wounding another. After this, Nelson and his gang scattered. Nelson and his family would leave for the San Francisco Bay Area of California, where Nelson would reconnect with John Paul Chase, his old pal. Nelson and Chase would work together for a year, leaving 3 dead bodies in their path, one of which would be a victim of Nelson's road rage. This poor victim had made the mistake of cutting Nelson off on the road. The 2 men got into a confrontation that ended with the other driver receiving a bullet in the head. Chase, Nelson, and his family would then return to Chicago, Illinois in April of 1934, where they would join the ranks of the Dillinger Gang, allegedly after financing Dillinger's escape from the Crown Point, Indiana jail on March 3, 1934. This escape, although some chalk it up to legend or exaggeration, was apparently accomplished by faking out the guards using wooden pistols. Whether exactly true or not, it makes for a great story. On March 5, 1934, 2 days after Nelson killed the man who had cut him off in traffic, Nelson and his crew would rob Security National Bank in Sioux, South Dakota. They gained about $50,000, and Nelson would shoot, although not kill, a police officer. The 6 men in the robbery were all identified, and once again, Nelson was on the run from vigilant law enforcement. Just 8 days later, on March 13th, Nelson and his crew robbed another bank, First National Bank in Mason City, Iowa. That's almost 200 miles away. This time, the crew got away with $52,000, and Dillinger was injured in the subsequent shootout. After this, Nelson and Chase headed back to Reno to recuperate. While in Reno, the 2 got mixed up with the local organized crime rings, in which they used to be an official part. In a brief side mission on March 22, 1934, Nelson and Chase kidnapped and murdered a talkative witness who intended to identify 2 of their previous bosses in a federal mail fraud case. Legend has it that the body of the witness, Roy Fitch's body, was quartered and thrown into an abandoned mine shaft. That remains speculation to this day, however, since Fitch's body has never been found. After that eventful month of March, Nelson, his wife Helen, Dillinger, 4 other associates, and their girlfriends decided to take a relaxing weekend vacation at the Little Bohemia Lodge in Manitowish Waters, Wisconsin. They would arrive on April 20th. It is speculated that when the owner of the lodge, Emil Winotka, had played cards with this gang, he went home and let his wife know that the Dillinger crew was staying at the lodge. Mrs. Winotka, unable to keep a secret like this to herself, told others, and soon word got to the FBI. They were tipped off on April 22nd. As regular lodge attendees were leaving from the dinner rush, FBI agents mistook 3 men who did not realize agents were on the scene. Believing these men were fleeing the scene in their vehicle, the officers opened fire, killing one of them. A real tragedy, to be sure. And to make matters worse, all of the chaos of this shootout made Nelson aware that the FBI agents were on the scene, and he and his crew made a break for it. I should note, however, that other sources claim that it wasn't the chaos from this that alerted Nelson, but instead a barking dog that saw the agents. Regardless, the Nelson crew escaped out of the back of the lodge. Nelson himself went to a nearby home after having made 2 hostages at gunpoint from the road drive him away from the scene. He did engage in a shooting match with agents before he made his escape, though. He always had to make the situation worse. This nearby house happened to belong to a switchboard operator, Alvin Kerner, who knew what was going on. Before Nelson broke into his home and took Kerner and his family hostage, Kerner had alerted the authorities. Soon, FBI agents W. Carter Baum and J. Newman, in addition to the local police officer Carl Christensen, were on the scene. After the law enforcement officers identified themselves, Nelson opened fire, injuring all 3 of them, and in Baum's case, he was fatally injured. Nelson then stole the FBI vehicle, drove 15 miles, got a flat tire, tried to change it, couldn't, then continued his escape on foot. He would later steal another vehicle, then keep going. In case you were wondering, he did actually leave his wife behind in Little Bohemia. She was arrested, charged, and convicted for harboring a fugitive. She would be released on parole. This Little Bohemia fiasco actually caused people to call for the resignation of J. Edgar Hoover. It didn't happen, of course, but this was a huge controversy and left the FBI with a black eye. Nelson and his wife a month later would reconvene with Chase and live near Lake Geneva, Wisconsin for a span of several days. They didn't stop committing crime, though. By June 30th, 1934, they had participated in another bank robbery in South Bend, Indiana. An officer was shot and killed in the process. They would then move to Chicago, where Nelson would shoot and kill 2 more officers who had found the gang's hideout. After John Dillinger was shot and killed on July 22, 1934, Nelson, his wife, and Chase left for California. They would make several trips back and forth between the Golden Coast and the Windy City. At one point, they were even pulled over for speeding, but not recognized by the police officer, and they received a $5 fine. Their vehicle, which contained all kinds of weaponry that would have led to their capture, was not searched. By November 26, 1934, Nelson, his wife, and Chase had finished their back-and-forth hiding between Chicago and California. They stole a vehicle and returned to Wisconsin from Chicago. By this point, Nelson was literally public enemy number 1, and law enforcement was all over him. The next day, the FBI was tipped off that Nelson, whose case was headed by Inspector Samuel P. Cowley, had stolen another vehicle and was making a break for it again. This time, 2 agents spotted the vehicle and a shootout ensued. Inspector Cowley and Special Agent Herman Edward Hollis were soon on the scene and engaging Nelson and Chase. They were able to stop the car, but were unable to stop the violence. Special Agent Hollis was killed in the crossfire and Cowley was mortally wounded. He would die the next morning as a result of his injuries from the shootout. Despite taking out 2 FBI agents, this would be Nelson's last stand because he was also mortally wounded. Nelson and Chase stole Cowley's vehicle. As they made their escape, Helen Gillis, who had been lying in the field during the shootout, jumped into the vehicle as it drove away. That evening, around 8 p.m., Nelson's body was discovered near Niles Center, Illinois. Someone had called and tipped off the FBI to the body's location. Helen Gillis was arrested on November 29, 1934, for violating the terms of her parole, and served 1 year behind bars at the Women's Federal Reformatory in Milan, Michigan. Chase would be found later and was made to spend a term in Alcatraz. Lester Joseph Gillis is buried at St. Joseph Cemetery in River Grove, Illinois. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Racket Reviews discussing the short life and violent death of the bloodthirsty bank robber Babyface Nelson. Now, on this very special episode of Racket Reviews, I want to introduce you to another babyface, and that's the new boss around here, Babyface Coletti. Many of you have been very supportive throughout this time, and I appreciate your messages. You guys have been so supportive. Thank you for continuing to support the channel as I've taken a maternity leave to get used to motherhood and used to the challenges that come along with having a new boss around here. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it, and so does he, I'm sure, although he can't express it himself. And I want you to know that your dedication to the channel and allowing me to take this time has made all the difference in the world. Make sure to like, subscribe, and click notifications to get more Mafia content sent directly to your sub box. Ciao.